I want you to imagine something with me. What if someone knocked on your door one day and told you there was an animal in your backyard that you didn't know about? It turns out that the animal is a rare species, maybe one you've never heard of before. What if they took it one step further and told you, as a matter of fact, scientists have searched the entire world over and have only ever found it in your backyard? Would you believe them? Would you search for it? When you inevitably found it, would you share it with others, exploit it for your own profits and pleasure, or would you protect it? Good people of the Ozarks will need to answer these questions sooner rather than later, because I'm knocking on your door and I'm here to tell you there's a critter in your backyard, and he's pretty special.
This episode is part one of a 5-part mini-series all about an animal that many in the outdoor community have called the symbol of the Ozarks. It has earned that reputation by its resiliency, its tendency to be overlooked and underrated, its hard-fighting nature, and its unique ability to carve out a life for itself in places others might see as uninhabitable. Once thought to be nothing more than a slight variant or subspecies of a widely known smallmouth bass, years of research and genetic testing have concluded that the Ozarks endemic species is not only significantly different, it actually precedes the smallmouth bass in its genetic lineage.
To talk us through the journey of how these groundbreaking scientific developments came to light, we are joined by one of the scientists whose own research was directly responsible for elevating the subspecies to its own species in 2022, Dr. Andrew Taylor of the University of North Georgia. We're also privileged to be joined by another esteemed black bass researcher and professor at Oklahoma State University, Dr. Taylor's longtime mentor and Ozark native of Springfield, Dr. Jim Long. Listen now as they introduce us to the Ozark's very own endemic species of black bass, Micropterus velox, aka the Neosho bass.
So the history goes pretty far back, well before genetics or any modern techniques we use today. Basically just looking at the core scale appearance of the fish, maybe doing some counts of scales along the lateral line or number of spines in the dorsal fin or rays in the dorsal fin. We call those meristics, things that can be counted. And sometimes also we would throw in what are called morphometrics, so measuring body shape, dimensions of the jaw to the head or the head to the body or something like that. But it goes, way back, 1800s back of there is a largemouth bass, there is a smallmouth bass. And for a period of time, there were others being described, such as the spotted bass. And then there was this really instrumental book by James Henshaw, who's known as the apostle of the black bass.
Okay.
It's called the Book of the Black Bass. It's the Bass Bible. And he said, there are but two. There are the largemouthed and there are the smallmouthed. So even though others had been described, he kind of realigned them all into there's two.
Okay.
And we kind of rolled with that.
And that set the stage for black bass biology.
Until two really instrumental ichthyologists by the names of Hubbs and Bailey. I believe they were out of the University of Michigan.
So an ichthyologist is...
Ichthyologist, the study of fish.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's a good term.
Someone who studies fish. Ichthyology.
All right.
Yeah. So these ichthyologists kind of started, in the 40s, 50s period.
Yep.
They started publishing a number of papers that kind of were describing new species of bass, and what they were using is really counts. They were counting things on the fish and saying these counts they weren't even really using statistics we would hold ourselves to today in modern science, but they were just kind of these don't overlap very much, so it's probably enough of a difference to be a different species.
Okay.
And they got a lot of stuff right just by counting scales and fin rays and spines and things like that. They discovered things like the red-eye bass, and they re-elevated spotted bass, and they started doing all of that work. And in 1940, they started to really take a look at smallmouth bass kind of across their range, counting all those same things. And they were like, oh, these over here in the Ozarks, they kind of have a different body shape. They kind of look like they're built for swift water. They kind of have this like very hydrodynamic look to them. And their scale counts are kind of slightly different. Their look is kind of slightly different, but to the era they were working in, they did not believe it was a big enough difference to say it was a different species.
Okay.
So they said at that time you could very commonly say they're different, but they're not really different enough to be different species. So based on what we measured, we're going to call them subspecies.
Got it.
And so we already had Micropterus dolomieu, the smallmouth bass. It's very broad range across the Mississippi up to the Great Lakes, down into the Ozarks, Arkansas, and even down into like North Alabama, North Georgia.
Right.
Broad distribution. And they basically said, well, this little chunk of the Ozarks, basically these systems that drain to the Arkansas River. So you kind of start with like the Spring River and Shoal Creek in Missouri, and everything that kind of drains westward off that face of the Ozarks towards the Arkansas River, and then kind of also southward. So things like the Mulberry River, Big Piney River, that group of streams, they're a little bit different.
Yeah.
So we're going to call them subspecies, and we've got what they called Micropterus dolomieu, and then they gave it a subspecies name, Velox.
Okay. And talk me through the taxonomy of that, because I think a lot of people maybe have forgotten their biology 101 class that they took in 6th or 7th grade or whatever.
Yeah.
Where you've got, we have the animal kingdom, and then within that, you have this series of names down to the species level, and then even subspecies. Maybe just kind of generically talk through someone who's just needs a refresher on that.
Yeah, so we've got, we can.
This is me included. I need a refresher on this.
So kingdoms are like the highest level difference.
Kingdom is fish.
No, even above that.
Okay.
Like unicellular versus multicellular type differences.
I needed a refresher.
There you go.
Like, are we talking like bacteria, or are we talking like plants and animals type differences?
Got it.
All the way down, we've got kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. But really, like, we could kind of carve out, like, for bass, we're talking about things that are vertebrates, right? They have a backbone. We're talking about within those things that have backbones, we're talking about things that we call fish, bony fish, and then a certain type of bony fish. So we're stepping our way down this taxonomy to basically family Syncharchidae, which is pretty low on that taxonomy ranking. Family Syncharchidae are the sunfishes.
Okay.
North American. They're just North America.
North American sunfish.
And maybe a little bit into Central America. Well,
American.
Yeah, they're American.
Okay.
And then we've got, where am I at? Family would be genus Micropterus.
And that's like the black bass
The black
genus.
bass genus.
Okay.
Yeah, so these are different from sunfish, which would be other genuses like Lepomus.
Which is like the long ear and the green sunfish and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then Amblopleides, which is like your Ozark
The
bass.
Ozark bass, which we've been talking about for a long time now.
Right. And then we're getting down to species below Micropterus. Okay, well, there's different types of black bass. There's different types of Micropterus. So then we're adding a species name.
Okay.
And back then they would say like, well, if they look to be kind of different, but they're not different enough to be species, we'll just add another name, which is an even smaller subcategory. So within smallmouth, they said Micropterus dolomieu. Well, we've got subcategories now of subspecies. Micropterus dolomieu, Velox.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So like a largemouth
So it gets
bass,
way down that taxonomy.
You really narrow it
We're down
down
at the very bottom, right?
But it's helpful within the scientific community because you can say the Latin name and know specifically which species you're talking about, and you can really hone in on like what animal it is, typically where it lives, behavioral patterns, genetics, things like that, reproductive isolation, and so forth. So for a largemouth, guys who are like largemouth, smallmouth fishermen, what's a largemouth genus species?
That's a great question. It's kind of a loaded question to ask me.
Okay.
Absolutely.
To the regular guy, maybe.
To the regular, so largemouth bass, we're going to call that Micropterus. For the longest time, it was Micropterus salmoides.
Okay.
due to some recent genetic work that I was a part of, and kind of a crossover to what we're going to talk about with Neosho Bass, we actually found that the names needed to be adjusted. So the modern accepted species name is largemouth bass Micropterus nigricans.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. And that's today.
That's as of now.
But for the longest time, it was
Salmoides.
Salmoides.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that kind of alludes to like even early people who came through, like William Bartram, a naturalist. He would talk about the salmon of the South. So it was like, yeah, they were catching like big largemouth bass, but they didn't really call them bass then.
Yeah.
So Salmoides kind of alludes to that. It's like a warm water salmon.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
What factors go into the differentiation between this is different enough to be its own species? You know, there's
another loaded question.
There's a genetic standpoint. There's reproductive isolation.
Yeah.
There's behavioral, ecological, some things like that. What for you do those boxes have to be checked?
Yeah. So the first thing to kind of understand, if you're looking at this and trying to sort out like how the scientists are trying to sort through this, you have to understand that not all scientists really agree on what a species is.
Okay.
So like when we go through our intro biology classes, you know, maybe in high school, maybe you take like a non-majors bio in college or something like that. Typically what you learn as the species concept is the biological species concept, which is largely based on reproductive isolation.
Okay.
Meaning that these two entities cannot produce viable offspring.
Mm-hmm.
They may be able to produce a hybrid, but that hybrid has to be infertile. It stops there.
Got it.
Right? Well, with fish, you can pretty much throw that out the window, right?
Okay.
Like most of our bony fish that we, you know, when we think about trout, bass, they reproduce, they lay eggs outside their body. And the gametes kind of crisscross outside the body, usually in a general area like a nest or a red or something like that. Things get the potential to go where they don't belong, and there's a lot of times that hybrids happen naturally in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times those hybrids are still viable enough to then mate again. So that whole concept kind of goes out the window with most fish.
Okay.
Or a lot of fish.
Yeah.
So then you start thinking like, well, you know, and this has been like an ongoing discussion in the scientific community for as long as there's been the idea of a species. It's like, where do we draw the line?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we draw the line?
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of other concepts of what can justify a species designation. So there's like ecological. So like, do they use different habitats? Do they, spawn at different times of the year, stuff like that. We have evolutionary, which basically means, well, are they isolated from one another? Maybe they're not reproductively isolated, but if they're kind of headed down a different path evolutionarily, maybe they're different species.
Yeah.
And so we kind of start to think about, especially with the bass, given that the biological species concept doesn't necessarily hold up at all. I mean, you can think about the most different two black bass. You've got like largemouth bass and smallmouth bass. They hybridize.
Mm-hmm.
Rarely, but they do.
But it does
They
happen.
can. It can happen.
Interesting.
It's rare, but it can happen.
Yeah.
So you think about the two most different ones. Well, then everything in between, it's kind of like, well, if they get, if you mix the two wrong combination, anything can happen.
Yeah.
So we start to think about all the other concepts. And you're trying to find homology where you've got, or agreement. You're trying to find agreement.
Okay.
So if there's some ecological differences, if there's some evolutionary trajectory, if there's all these different signals, you can start to be fairly sure that what you're seeing is justifiable as like elevating it to a species designation.
Yeah.
I do have one question on that. Dr. Long, maybe you can help parse out what we mean by this, but when you say evolutionary trajectory, so like things are changing and hybridizing and evolving at different paces. What does that mean? What are you looking for? What are you trying to define when you say that?
Well, I mean, we can see patterns that in the genetics.
Okay.
So when you look at the genes themselves, you can, it's easy to see where those differences are, that there are differences, and you can get a scale of how big are the differences. sometimes the fish may not look very different, but the genes tell a very different story.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you get an idea that the genetics are different, then you start to look at, well, where are these fish living? Are they in uplands? Are they lowlands? Are they, Andrew talked about the Neosho being in these watersheds that drain to the Arkansas River. Well, the Arkansas River is not full of smallmouth bass.
Mm-hmm.
It's a barrier.
Hmm.
And so that is an area then where it would prevent mixing with other kinds. So we now see, oh, that's an area of differentiation. That's a different trajectory. These fish have now been left on a different trajectory than fish in other parts of their range. And so
Gotcha.
that's what we would look at.
Interesting.
It's kind of like a combination of isolation.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, there's not a lot of gene flow happening between these pockets of where these fish can live.
Yeah.
And then unique, what we call natural selection pressures. So that unique environment. Maybe they're having to deal with higher temperatures or more common flooding or you name it, right?
Yeah.
Over time, that starts to kind of influence the gene pool.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the appearance of the fish, maybe the life history of the fish, when they spawn,
Mhm.
how old they live to,
Yeah.
things like that. Sometimes with our genetic tools, we wonder, we find these like, oh, they're X% different. What does that mean? And that's kind of where science is now headed with these newest like genomic methods is what they call them, where you can actually kind of pair your genetic signals up to a like mapped genome and kind of understand like, oh, well, they're X% different overall,
Right.
but where do those differences lie and what do those differences mean?
Yeah.
And that's kind of like the great unknown right now for bass.
Yeah.
It's something that really excites me is
Yeah.
to try to figure out, we know that these are genetically different. We know like to a degree, a scale, like how different they are.
Yeah.
But what do those differences mean like in their genes?
Right.
We
Which
can
genes
study-
are being influenced.
Gotcha.
Largely, I suspect it's going to reflect what we know about their ecology. But the truth is, for a lot of these critters, we don't even know their basic ecology because we're just now really coming to understand, oh, they are different,
Gotcha.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
So,
If we think back to Hubbs and Bailey, when they described the subspecies, they basically said scale counts are a little different, head shape's a little different, and that's where they stopped.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so for the next, 60, 70, 80 years, it was still kind of a smallmouth.
we just kind of treated it like, yeah, it's just a
Right.
unique little
Strain.
strain
Yeah.
of this bigger species. And so we can infer a lot about what it should be doing based on fish over in Tennessee or up in the Great Lakes even, you know,
Yeah.
like that, because they're everywhere.
Man, that is
Because it's a smallmouth.
What made you want to go a little bit deeper on either confirming or challenging the assertion that, hey, this species, this specific Neosho right here, we think might actually be something a little bit different?
I don't think that I ever kind of thought to myself, oh, I'm going to challenge this.
Okay.
Or I think I'm driven by curiosity. So I grew up bass fishing. As soon as I caught my first red-eye bass, so I lived in Northwest Georgia. Red-eye bass is like one of the native endemics there. As soon as I got a hold of one of those, I was like, I have to learn all I can learn about this. And so I've just been really blessed to be able to be in a position now where I'm actually contributing new knowledge to that discussion, doing what I love. But I think when I was in Georgia, I got to work with a really well-known ichthyologist down in the Southeast, Bud and Mary Freeman. They're a husband and wife dynamic duo. They describe a lot of non-game fish, minnows, darters, but he had been kind of working on red-eye bass.
Okay.
And he had kind of noticed like, hey, these in the Savannah River, which kind of borders the Georgia, South Carolina border, look very strikingly different. Is there something there? So my senior thesis, like finishing my undergraduate, was actually working in his lab, learning all those same scale counts that Hubbs and Bailey would do, to go through and look basin by basin, are there big enough differences? And we kind of laid the groundwork for kind of talking about like the Bartram's bass, the Altamaha bass, which are kind of in our vernacular now within like the angling community. We know these things are there.
Yeah.
And so that kind of like, I think honed my eye to like, I kind of know the things to look for. When I hold a bass in my hands, I can appreciate its beauty just as I could when I was a little kid. But I also start being like, how many dorsal spines does it have? How, it's kind of also like an illness I have now. It's like I
wanna
can't
go
just
fishing
go and
with you.
enjoy fish and fishing. Like now I have to like look at them with a more inquisitive, like fine-tuned eye.
Yeah.
So like we did that yesterday when we were looking at some of the fish we were catching. Like,
Yeah.
okay, how's the pigmentation different and things like that.
That's a great sidebar for 2.5 seconds. The reason we all were able to meet in
yeah.
Arkansas is y'all were going after the bass. Was it just Arkansas Grand Slam?
No.
The smallmouth slam.
Smallmouth
We-
slam?
I guess we're calling it
We kind of called it
the endemic smallmouth
Endemic.
Grand Slam.
Okay.
endemic smallmouth bass species complex slam.
Wow. We're going to need to work on the marketing of this.
Yeah, exactly. So our idea, Jim put this together. Basically, we wanted to go and get fish from the Ouachita Basin, which drains off the Ouachita Mountains, the Little River Basin, which drains off the Ouachita Mountains, but to a different watershed.
Yep.
Essentially, they're not really connected until they hit the main stem Mississippi River,
Okay.
which is a long way.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of habitat there that smallmouth do not occur in.
So pretty isolated.
They're very, very isolated. Yeah, like we're talking like on the scale of like 1 million years or more.
Wow.
I mean, it's just like we talked about the
Yeah.
Neosho Bass. There's no smallmouth in the Arkansas. The Arkansas is not smallmouth habitat.
Yeah.
Right.
The Little River, as it runs through the lower part of the coastal plain, through the coastal plain of Arkansas and into Louisiana.
These are just hot, muddy,
Right.
slow moving. You're gonna get
Right.
largemouth, maybe some spotted bass, gar,
Yeah.
bowfin.
Right.
Yeah.
They're lowland
Right.
streams.
So those two, where else?
Yeah, and then we went up. We crossed the Arkansas River
Yep.
into the Ozarks and got a Neosho bass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the mulberry.
And that was all yesterday. You guys knocked all that out in one day.
One
Yeah.
day.
It was a long day.
Impressive.
And so you're saying as you're catching those,
Oh yeah.
You're
we
looking
were
at 'em, you're getting
really
excited.
close. Yeah.
what are you looking for?
So I mean, in our mind, like some of our work that we've done with the genetics and genomics, we've kind of solidified even previous work that's kind of said there appears to be differences there. Well, every time we kind of increase our resolution with new and improved methods, we just see like, we just
Genetic
continue.
methods.
Yeah.
We just continue to reaffirm with even more assurance and accuracy. These are different
Yeah.
from a gene standpoint, right? From a DNA standpoint.
Yeah.
And so then the question is, like visually, are they different?
Yeah. Other than-
Ecologically, are they different?
Yeah.
Because we really haven't ever had the premise to go and say, like, we've just always thought they're smallmouth, right? So it's kind of opened our eyes, and even we've talked about like, gosh, we used to go take genetic samples, and we didn't look at these things carefully enough. Because as we learn more information, you can start to kind of see, you start to train your eyes to different things,
Yeah.
right? And you start to wonder like, do these things align with this new concept of what's what?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what we were looking at, like different pigmentation patterns and different body shapes, and and trying to figure out like, is there some something we can point to say, okay, yeah, if I have this in my hands, I can look for these suite
Right.
of characteristics and really feel for sure without running the DNA analysis.
Because if
that
you
we
have
have
one
what
in
we have.
hand, you'd like to know what is it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And location is a good key, but there's been a lot of fish being stocked, and so there are hybrids in certain places.
Right.
And so location isn't always the answer. And so
Yeah.
then the question is, well, what do I look for? How do I? And that's something that still needs parsed out.
Okay.
Yeah, it's unknown to. We like have our hunches because we're anglers and we've held these fish before, right?
Right.
But until a formal analysis is done to really put numbers to it, it's kind of a great unknown.
Gotcha. So that's kind of the background. At what point did the research begin? And then just the process of it, after we kind of set that up, we can reveal the findings.
Yeah. So the stars kind of aligned where I left my home in Georgia. I had lived in my whole life to go work on my PhD in bass conservation with Dr. Long in Oklahoma. And I got the opportunity to kind of start to do some stuff locally, in Oklahoma. And, I had read about, Neosho smallmouth bass being kind of a subspecies. That really intrigued me. The Ozarks are beautiful. I'm a stream fisherman. I want to go to the Ozarks and catch some fish. And actually, I went on a stream ecology field trip, and we were, electrofishing and learning all about the native, like, non-game fish. And when we got done, there was like an hour of just free time. And I had asked the professor, can I bring my fishing pole? And they're like, sure, whatever. And a few casts in, I caught my first Neosho smallmouth bass at that time.
Okay.
And I'm like, oh my God, these things are very visually distinct. And it just like sparked me. Wow, everything that I read in that Hubbs and Bailey paper where they're describing the differences, that I see that and just it's so striking. And then I was thinking, like, this is like, again, like a great research opportunity or path to take, because we know they live in a very small area. They're confined to just a few select streams, and we know virtually nothing about them, right? I mean, there had been a lot of previous work done, but we didn't really know that they were unique.
Everybody kept expecting them to be smallmouth.
Yeah.
And they were like, why are they a little bit smaller?
Yeah.
Why are they why is their population densities a little different?
So for you, who has a longer career and growing up in Springfield, you were probably familiar with this idea of a Neosho strain, right?
A little bit, but it never got much press.
Really?
So when I got involved with this kind of work, it was around the blanket of bass diversity. And I helped organize some symposia that led to a book, and the book came out in 2015, but the first symposium was 2009. And then the National Wildlife Fish Federation, NFWF, created a 10-year conservation program focused on diversity. And we, made sure to include Neosho bass in that. Most of the other endemic black basses that get talked about are things like Andrew's been talking about, like in North Georgia and Alabama, all the red-eye bass complex, shoal bass, those things. And so we want to make sure to include those. And so for me, ever since, say, about 2009, is when I've been engaged to do something about diversity. And so when I came back to Oklahoma, working with, Neosho, which was kind of known. There was also some thought that there is another one, the Ouachita bass, but it was Andrew's work later. There's actually two. There's Little River and Ouachita, and maybe that's for later also. But that's what got me into it.
Okay, gotcha. So you guys kick off the research. You're looking for these types of things. You saw one. You're like, this is different. So it kind of spurred you on to continue that curiosity.
Yeah, and so some of the first studies we did, I'm very, like, conservation-minded. Like, everything I do with my research, I want it to inform management of the fishery, but also, more importantly, in my mind, conserving things that are maybe not so common, right, that we might not want to take for granted. And so one of the first things that we wanted to do was just a scan across the landscape, grab genetic tissues and see where do we have good intact populations of Neosho smallmouth bass at the time, Neosho smallmouth bass, versus where do we see signals of maybe what would be non-native to the area, smallmouth bass, had been stocked into some of the lakes, and we already knew that. Like, we knew from stocking records that they had been moved in and around the Ozarks some. So we just, but they're really hard to tell apart in hand, right? So we're like, we'll do a genetic survey. And we used pretty coarse scale methods, but it was adequate enough to answer that question, right? And so we saw, there are areas where, unfortunately, the two are hybridizing rampantly. There are still areas where Neosho bass are, like, relatively, like, I hate to use the word pure, but, like, they're not hybridizing. They're still them.
Yeah.
They're still them.
The original. Okay.
The OG.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
OG
so we've got, that's really, that was really like we got that publication out really quickly because we felt like that's really valuable information.
Was that
like
the 2019 study?
Was that, like 2018, 2019.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was in North American Journal of Fisheries Management because, again, we want the managers to know, like, what do you have in your, Missouri Department of Conservation, Arkansas Game and Fish Commission? Like, what do you have, right? It's very powerful information that you can act upon.
Yeah.
And from there, with those core scale methods, we include a bunch of different bass species that we know are different species because we want to make sure that they're not hybridizing with the Neosho smallmouth bass. And basically, the long story short is the Neosho bass really just kind of popped out genetically.
Yeah.
Like, whoa, like they're different.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, well, this does very much track with like all the previous work that's been done, right? We know like morphologically they're a little bit different, visually they're a little bit different, genetically, like wow,
Yeah.
you know. And so that kind of led to, you know, well, we want to know more. And so one of the things we were able to do is kind of up our tools, get a little bit higher, finer resolution to be able to kind of tease apart what's where a little bit better, even to the point of kind of looking for within the Ozarks itself. One of our collaborators, Joe Gunn, so he's a postdoctoral student, so he's already finished his PhD.
Okay.
He did his PhD on smallmouth bass, Neosho bass, all across the Ozarks. And we kind of paired up with him because we were kind of like our research paths kind of converged.
Yeah.
We're like, well, you know, we can collaborate and maybe do something even bigger and better, right? And so it's been really fun to work with him. And he actually was even able to go across the range of Neosho bass in the Ozarks and see that there are actually genomic level differences in their genes between the streams that run off the Ozarks, the proper Ozark highlands, versus the Boston Mountains portion of the Ozarks, which has a slightly different geology. The water gets a little warmer.
Yeah, which would be like the Illinois Shoal Creek up in Missouri down to the west versus like the Mulberry, which drains south into
Right,
Arkansas.
it's kind of those south draining ones
Okay.
like Big Piney, Mulberry,
Lee
Illinois
Creek.
Illinois Bayou.
Illinois Bayou.
Yeah.
Yep.
Those are all kind of Boston Mountains
Yeah.
versus like the traditional, what I think of as like the traditional appearing Ozark stream that has gravel bottom.
Sure.
Groundwater springs would be like, Barren Fork or, yeah.
So one of the first things that made me think that these guys are different ecologically, though, so we've done the genetics.
Sure.
And it was that study that you talked about in 2019. We see these small streams tend to have more Neosho bass, where the larger streams, I mean, we saw a pattern where larger stream genomes, even disconnected, a big stream up here and a big stream here,
Yeah.
they were more genetically similar, whereas small streams that are also disconnected. And so one of the great examples for me then was Lake Tenkiller, where smallmouth were stocked.
Yeah.
And we see hybrids up into the Illinois River, which is the biggest tributary. But there's a small creek called Caney Creek that is closer to the lake, but it's a much smaller trib. Smallmouth aren't in there. They're only Neoshos. And so it made me think, that there's something about stream size and stream, stream size, really.
Yeah.
That
so ecologically, that it has to be something different.
Exactly. So the genetics are a great tool, and they show that there's different genetics, but when you pair it with other things on the landscape, for me, that was my first eye into they're acting differently.
Yeah, that's a huge unlock.
You know, another really huge part of this too, that we did know before we really started any of the genetics was talking about Lake Tenkiller, for example, where we've built impoundments in the Ozarks.
Right.
There were what we called at that time smallmouth in those streams, native. Those are the Neosho, right? When we flooded those impoundments, we fully expected, as one would, right? Because you look over at Tennessee, you've got great smallmouth fisheries in your impoundments.
Yeah.
We fully expected we'd have great smallmouth fishing, and it never materialized to the point where they had to go to Tennessee, bring those fish over and stock them into things like Lake Tenkiller. And then you're like, well, why did our smallmouth bass not live in the lake?
Yeah, what's the difference?
Right? And it's kind of like you look back on those things and you're like, God, this is like kind of a no-brainer.
It's like in our face.
Yeah.
But because, again, what we knew at the time was the scale counts are different.
Yeah.
For decades,
But
that's
it.
all we thought about. The ecology is only now starting to be looked at.
The other thing from a conservation standpoint that's really interesting to think about, we love fishing those lakes.
Mhm.
Like the majority of what I would call bass fishermen, they focus most of their effort where they can get their boats,
Yeah.
right? In lakes like Lake Tenkiller.
Right.
But from a conservation standpoint, it's kind of sad to think we actually took like a core part of the Neosho Bass's range and made it completely uninhabitable for
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. We reduced it
So
to
we've
these pockets.
replaced thinking that maybe those things would remain, and then we've had to kind of artificially go back and create that fishery again with something that's not actually native.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't
Like a
really
rainbow trout
belong.
below it too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Below it, too.
Yeah.
You'd mentioned conservation in your papers and why that's important for game management plans. And I just wanted to stress before Kyle asked another question and we moved on, why the Neosho bass being its own species for conservation is important. And I know we're going to keep talking about it, but it is so easy for the average person to think, well, it's all just smallmouth. And there's smallmouth everywhere.
Yeah.
And so if something happens to this one range over here, it's like, it's no big deal. But what you're saying is actually it is so different. It is such a narrow scope in which they can survive and thrive and for their native home range, like you have to manage for them or you're not going to have them anymore.
Yeah. 2022, fast forward me to that point in time where you said, here's our findings, here's what we've done, and here's what our findings were. And then we'll go into why that matters and why we have to manage to protect the species, conserve X, Y, Z.
You know, one of the things that always really bugged me about the bass world is we have really never held ourselves to a consistent standard. And I think part of it is inherent. You have different labs working on different fish in their part of the country, and they study them closely enough, and they're like, okay, well, these two things are different. But do those same magnitude of differences hold up when we start to look at different groups in different parts of the country? And we had like the red-eye bass complex being split into all the sub-basins. Like there's, now there's a warrior bass and a Tallapoosa bass and a Cahaba bass. And that's great, but were those magnitude of differences applied across the board to all the other bass? And so it was a big lingering question that I had. And I had started to amass this huge, us together, we had amassed this huge genetic data set that we could kind of start to tease apart some of those questions. And so I'd kind of put like on my pie in the sky, like research question list, like let's try to do this for all bass across all of their known ranges with a standard method and see really where the differences lie and how different each of these that we are already calling species are from one another. So I was thinking like, you got to draw a line in the sand. This level of difference is going to be a species for bass.
Right.
If you're not that level of difference, then maybe you're not.
Yeah.
Right? And so it was like kind of like the idea of maybe some of the things we're calling species could be collapsed back into one. But maybe there's many others out there that we're not applying that same rule to,
Yeah.
that same magnitude of difference to.
Because the goal is not proliferation to the extent that it's impossible to manage.
Absolutely
Right?
not.
Like you don't want 20 different species
That's-
within one area of fishing where it's like, okay, well, you can only keep 2 of this species on this day, and your creel limit, your daily limit. Like,
Oh my gosh,
That
no.
would just be endlessly impossible to enforce and manage.
And what we want is like there's a sweet spot, right? There's some practicality involved because if you over split,
Yeah.
you're gonna take the limited amount of resources we have to conserve these animals, and you're gonna make it basically impossible to do anything with any of them.
Yeah.
Right. But you want to know with the limited resources we have to do management and conservation that you're focusing your effort on things that are very real
Yeah,
and different and meaningful, right? And so I linked up. So I had just started my job at University of Central Oklahoma, which I'm no longer there. But I was like, what are my research program going to look like now that I'm not really part of Jim's lab anymore? I'm like a lab alumni.
Right.
And I wanted to continue my black bass research. And so I kind of started kind of formulating a plan for how I would do this paper. And around the same time, I kind of heard mumblings that there was this PhD student at Yale in Tom Neer's lab, who's another very preeminent like ichthyologist. And instead of kind of the old school ichthyology where you do scale counts, he's kind of taken that, and he still does a lot of that, but he pairs it with like the best, like newest genomic methods to kind of see like where the genes are, but also where the appearance aligns. And so I had heard rumors. I'd never met. I'd never even talked to either of them before, really. So I went out on a limb and I said, you know what? If this is going to be his PhD project, then I don't want to interfere with that, but I want to actually like elevate that if I can contribute, right?
Yeah.
So I reached out to them. We started talking. It became a really great collaboration. And essentially, we published that paper in 2022 with him as lead author because he did most of the brunt of the genomic analysis.
Right.
And then I kind of helped them like contextualize it because I'm, very familiar with the black bass world in that realm. And yeah, one of the big findings was kind of like what we were calling smallmouth bass as one species actually kind of bifurcates into 4 lineages. And the oldest lineage was Micropterus dolomieu velox. And we're like, wow, this is actually different enough compared to all the other species that we accept to be true, right? To be its own thing. Since it already had a subspecies name, it was very easy for us to then say, well, we can just elevate it to species and say it's Micropterus velox, Neosho bass. Now, where it got really interesting was the 3 other bifurcations below that were more recent in time, consisted of 2 lineages that are at home and isolated in the Ouachita Mountains, just south of the Ozarks. One that drains all the systems that drain off those mountains south that hit the Little River. We kind of call it Little River bass. It's not described, but we're saying this is a magnitude of difference that it probably is its own critter. It's a hypothesis, essentially.
Okay.
Right? And then we have a group just to the east of that all drains south off the Ouachitas into the Ouachita River Basin. Those would be their own. And then the most recent lineage, the one that we all know, is just smallmouth bass, which would be everything else that's not kind of here in that central highlands of the Ouachita and the Ozark Mountains.
Yep.
So you're telling me the research that you did with someone at Yale came back and there are 4 lineages of smallmouth bass. 3 of the 4, or actually all 4, are in the state of Arkansas?
Yes. Actually, Arkansas would be
all
the
4.
only place, I believe that's the only state you could get all 4.
Native.
Wow. Yeah.
That's amazing.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that is cool.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Help me break that apart maybe, because you said one is like a hypothesis. The Ouachita and the Little River bass, those are right now kind of initially a hypothesis, whereas
Right.
the Neosho is like, this is different.
Right. So it kind of goes into some really important, but in my opinion, I don't know, sometimes it feels kind of antiquated rules of like scientific nomenclature.
Okay.
So whenever we talked about the importance of scientific names, like when we have those, we call them the Latin binomials, right? The Micropterus is the genus, and then like Velox is the species. We know we're talking about this critter across any language, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of rules to that because there's a lot of ways that it could get really confusing if there weren't rules. And so if something's already been ascribed a subspecies name and then you find enough support to say it's a species, you can very easily adopt and apply that subspecies name to a species level.
Gotcha.
And drop the Micropterus dolomieu velox when it was a subspecies. Now it's just get rid of the dolomieu. It's its own thing, Micropterus velox.
Okay.
Yep. So that was very easy. Hubbs and Bailey had already done all that work.
Yeah.
So it's literally Hubbs and Bailey's legacy.
Yep.
And we've just now provided that one extra bit of very definitive evidence that this critter is different. We should treat it as a different name.
That's so
right.
cool. Yeah.
That in itself was like amazing for me. I'm like,
What
wow.
was that moment? Like, surely you're like sitting in the lab and you go, Eureka!
It's kind of weird because like we kind of started on that during COVID. And so, and of course I'm in central Oklahoma. They're in New Haven, Connecticut. So we're doing a lot of Zooms, Zoom calls, and Damon sitting on the Zoom call, and he's like, "So Andrew, I finally got around to all of your smallmouth samples that we've been looking at, and I think you're going to be really surprised by what we found." And he started stepping me through all the different subsets of results, and my eyes just like popping out of my head. Like I kind of suspected we would find some differences, but the scale of the differences, and also seeing that they're kind of the oldest lineage of what we always called smallmouth. They're like the grandfather. They're like the earliest evolutionary lineage that diverged from all the others.
Wait, so you're saying that the Neosho lineage dates back further than even the Dolomieu? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Really?
Once they're split.
Okay.
So a lineage that became all of those is pretty old, but Neosho diverged earliest
I
from
see.
all the others.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they're all kind of like, the ancestors were already on that path of becoming something smallmouth-like, and those that got isolated in the Ozarks kind of diverged first.
Wow.
Yeah. So they're like kind of the granddaddy of the smallmouths.
You heard it here first. The granddaddy of the smallmouth bass lives in the Ozarks.
Now, I know we've covered a lot of science and fascinating material so far, so we're going to end part 1 of our Neosho Bass series there for now.
Don't forget about us, though, because later on in this series, we'll pick up the conversation right where we left off with Dr. Taylor and Dr. Long to learn more about Micropterus velox. We'll also be welcoming on several other experts from around the country who will help us go deeper into what makes this fish unique, what it means to the Ozarks both culturally and economically, and we'll be sure to discuss at length why any of this matters in the first place. It matters because we are currently on a path that could lead to us losing this fish forever.